Hello, Ginger here, and as promised, we've got a little history on Christmas here. Now, in part, this is in response to some of the stuff that Jeremy Boring said on the most recent episode of the Daily Warriors Conversation. Essentially, that Christmas didn't exist until, I think he said, the 4th or 5th century AD, and it was essentially the church co-opting the previous Roman Sol Invictus pagan celebration of the winter solstice. And that's a very commonly accepted belief. It isn't really borne out, actually. Not a ton, anyway. Now, the reason I say that is we actually have records of Christians celebrating Christmas on December 25, as a matter of fact, all the way back to the very early 3rd century, like 2002, around there. From St. Hippolytus, who mentions the Feast of Christ's birth happening on December 25. We also have other evidence from Alexandria that dates to about the same period of time that says, yeah, there is and had been a Christian feast celebrating Christ's birth at least as early as the 3rd century. Given that we're talking about the very beginning of the 3rd century, chances are it dates back a little bit earlier than that. Now, the reason that's important is because we actually don't have certain record of Sol Invictus being celebrated until Emperor Aurelian in the year 274 AD. So we've got 274 and 200 something AD. 202, 211, something like that for St. Hippolytus. So that's a pretty huge difference. And it's a difference that works in the Christian's favor, as a matter of fact. So, yeah, the same thing applies to the Saturnalia, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, festival. We don't have any good records of that until after Christians had already been celebrating. At least some Christians had already been celebrating Christmas on December 25. Now, granted, that's Alexandria, that's in Egypt, it's not Rome. And there were, in fact, different dates. Dates were kind of all over the place, to be perfectly honest, for celebrations of Christmas or for the dating of Christ's birth. Most of them actually landed in the spring, as it turns out. But the point is, December 25 is something that's been around for a long time. It wasn't made the official date of the celebration until late in the 4th century. That's absolutely perfectly accurate. And there is evidence, again, of Christians confusing Christ and soul. Actually, that's fair to say. You get that from newadvent.com. That's basically the online Catholic encyclopedia, which actually gives a little bit more credence, frankly, to the Sol Invictus theory than my other primary source for this, which is Mike Flynn over at the TOFspot, which is tofspot.blogspot.com. And anyway, it gives a little bit more credence to that. But if you read closely, you'll notice that all of the dates referencing that confusion all fall after 274. So after the Emperor Aurelian decided to make this a thing, one could say, to try to co-opt the new holiday of these annoying Christians that were around. Yeah, and it would appear that he had some success with that. There were some that did get confused. Tertullian and many others, many of the other early church fathers did have to specifically call out that, hey, not the same. But again, it's important. Sol Invictus, as far as we know, wasn't around, or at least not a big thing, until 274, whereas we know Christians, at least in some places, were celebrating Christmas on December 25, much earlier in the same century. It's also, again, Saturnalia after Mithraism, that apparently didn't even develop, or at least if it existed, it after Christianity became a thing, it borrowed heavily from Christianity. So if anything, our evidence, and again, go check and read my sources for yourself, toffspot.blogspot.com, just search Christmas, it'll come up, and newadvent.com, which again is a Catholic encyclopedia, which gives a little bit more credence to the Sol Invictus theory. So there you go. If anything, the evidence goes towards pagans trying to co-opt Christians as opposed to the other way around. It's also worth noting that there was not actually a feast of any kind on December 25, according to the Roman calendar. Now, there were some that were close to it. That's because they had holidays for every freaking thing. Okay, we here in the West, especially in America, we're used to relatively few holidays. I mean, there's, roughly speaking, a dozen national holidays, and maybe you get half of those off for work. So those are the half you really care about, right? Let's be honest. So, but the Romans, they had holidays, they had feast days all over the freaking place. In fact, Mr. Flynn, he actually has a little bit of a calendar up on his website that shows some of the dates that they had. Let's see here. Following our festivals under the Republic for the month of December. I'm going to bring this over so that I don't get all distracting. Oh, we've got one on December 3 and 4, some women's festival. Some other pagan rural festival that got brought into the city on December 5, another one on December 11, another on December 12, another on December 17th. That's Saturnalia, which could last multiple days. December 19, December 21, December 23, and January 1. So, yeah, a lot. Guess what? If the church had any holiday anywhere in December, you're going to fall on or close to some pagan Roman thing. And it's the same with the other ones too. They're like, oh, that was you just co-opted that from pagans. No. Because this gets said about Easter, of course. This gets said about, not so much about All Saints' Day. Most people only know about the eve of All Saints' Day, which would be Halloween. People say these things all the time, and it's one of those things that everybody knows, but it's wrong. This thing that everyone seems to think they know is wrong. Plain and simple. The evidence doesn't support it. Now, again, it's also worth noting that those who are arguing for December 25 or any specific date for Christ's birth, they never anywhere, and I'm talking about the early church fathers, our early sources on this, they're never saying anywhere, and as far as I know, there's no record anywhere of anyone saying in any correspondence, hey, let's see if we can, peg the birth of Christ at this particular date so that we can, it'll make it easier for those pagans to come on over. They're celebrating this time or about that time, and we're just going to be like, hey, you become Christian and you can still have a party. That reasoning is never in there. There are actual arguments. Now, you might not think the arguments are valid. That's fine. But the point is they make actual arguments based on evidence such as they had, based on rational reasons according to the standards of the times, which I'm actually going to get into that briefly here in just a moment. The fact is that they were arguing for something that they believed, not for something they thought would just be expedient. Now, could others have used it for expediency? Sure. But the fact is, you're trying to read into the motives of people who existed like 2,000 years ago, or 1,800 years ago, or 1,500 years ago, depending on who you want to pick on in particular. So the argument, it doesn't really hold any water. Now, as far as specific Christmas traditions, now you want to start talking about lights, Yule logs, Christmas trees, all kinds of other things, the use of the reindeer and everything. Yeah, these come from different pagan celebrations from all over the place. That's 100% true. Christmas trees, yes. That was part of some form of Roman paganism of some kind. I'm not sure what, to be perfectly honest. Yule logs, yeah. Yeah, Germans were into that sort of thing. Let's see, what else? The reindeer, this Norse. That's kind of how they come in. There's a lot of imagery and everything that actually we would associate with the Norse. In fact, maybe sometime I'll do an episode, probably not this year, maybe next year, I'll do an episode on St. Nicholas and how he became Santa Claus. I think that would be fun. That did get passed through the Norse a lot and picked up a lot of accretions along the way. So, again, as far as my standards of the time comment, part of the reason for December 25 is that there is an old tradition that great prophets would die on the same day that they were born or conceived. Now, why is that relevant to Jesus? Well, obviously, the early Christians carried on a lot of the same traditions of Judaism. In fact, there were big arguments over how much to carry on. For those who are familiar with the Bible, that's recorded right there in Acts and in some of the later letters, as a matter of fact, when they're arguing how much of the Mosaic law should they hold the Gentiles accountable for. This isn't quite at that level, but it's a similar sort of thing, carrying on certain traditions, certain modes of thought, because again, certainly the earliest Christians didn't see themselves as such a radical break from Judaism. They saw themselves as the natural fulfillment, as living the natural fulfillment of it. Not a radical break, a transformation, the next stage, if you will. And so Jesus's conception got associated with March 25, in part because people trying really hard to figure this out because they wanted to know the exact date. They actually did care about this a lot, much more so than most moderns do. Most people who want to say, well, Jesus wasn't really born on December 25, they don't really care personally, except to use it as a club, as a gotcha. Most Christians, I think, are pretty aware of the fact that it may or may not have been December 25 and don't much care. Although there's someone like, well, you know what? I know a thing. Well, anyway, the part of the reason they settled on March 25 as the date of Jesus's conception was they were figuring it from the date of Zechariah's week in the temple. Okay, more history for you. Zechariah was Mary's uncle. There's a story. She goes when she's pregnant with Jesus to visit her cousin Elizabeth. All right, and Elizabeth is Zechariah's wife, and he was one of the goodness. Yes, I think he was a Levite, and as such, he had his week to care in the temple. And based on figuring out what that week is, and again, according to New Advent, this is not reliable at all. Like you're grasping at straws. You're trying to hang your hat on something here. But this was part of the rationale. So let's, for the sake of argument, to illustrate the point. So with that's when he found out that Elizabeth was pregnant with John the Baptist. And so 6 months later, Mary got the visit from Gabriel. Okay, so 6 months after his week in the temple, which his week in the temple was like September, October or something. I'd have to do math. And anyway, figuring out from there, 6 months later, Jesus was conceived, which they figured was March 25. And then 9 months later, you get to December 25. That's pretty simple, really. And then, of course, they would figure that he was crucified on March 25 also, apparently. Again, that's a date for the crucifixion. I don't think New Advent gives that a ton of credence. Maybe not. I don't know. But Again, I'm just explaining part of the rationale. And the reason for that is this kind of belief in a pattern. And yes, literally a cosmic pattern of, especially great men being conceived and dying on the same day is just that kind of thing, that kind of cyclical pattern to the cosmos is something that the entire ancient world believed. So to make arguments based on that, according to the standards of the time, is not illogical at all. Now, I don't think that particularly holds a whole lot of water. I don't really care a whole lot. There are other reasons for going with a December 25 date that I might look into more in the future. One has to do with, I think, the position of the planet Jupiter in the constellation Leo. I heard a fairly long argument, a long discussion, I should say, of this on the Catholic Laboratory podcast, which has long since stopped operating, unfortunately. But it was run by a chemist from Scotland, Ian something or another. Look at Catholic Laboratory. I think he's got the Facebook page still operating. So definitely check that out, and you might still be able to find some information there. So there's that, and basically, and that kind of makes sense because the wise men, it's generally believed that they were astrologers. I mean, they did say that they saw signs and whatnot. And yeah, so they would have been looking up in the sky for some sort of sign that something was happening somewhere. And it's, some believe apparently that they were tracking Jupiter, which of course Jupiter is, the king of the Roman pantheon. Or you can call him Zeus if you want to get into the whole how much did the Romans borrow from the Greeks and all of that jazz. So, and then, they saw that coming. They would have gotten, hopped on their camels or whatever and hot-footed it over to Israel based on that. That gets into the whole thing was, well, but astrology is not legit. No, of course not. But sometimes God works with weird stuff and he'll write straight with crooked lines, as this cliche goes. Another one has to do with the appearance of a comet, apparently. Again, I need to do some more research on this, but I think there's a book out there called The True Star of Bethlehem or something like that. I'll have to look at that before I actually comment any more on it. So anyway, but again, so that's basically Christmas not really inspired by a pagan holiday. And it's been celebrated in some places, at least, going all the way back to the very beginning of the 3rd century, if not the end of the 2nd. Now, but how did Christmas come to be? Christmas actually, while it was celebrated, it wasn't the biggest feast on the Christian calendar. That, of course, was Easter. And I talked about this a little bit in the last episode. I'm going to take a drink a sec. Last episode, I was talking about Advent. And the church decided to try to start to make it a bigger deal. And as such, added on the Advent season to better mirror the whole run up from Lent to Easter. And yeah, basically decided that we needed that little period of penance before the celebration, just as before. And of course, still in the Christian calendar, the Easter is still the far bigger deal, even if we haven't made as much of a show about it. For some reason, we find it a lot harder to commercialize someone getting crucified and rising from the dead than a birthday. Weird, I know. Which I'm actually really glad that Easter has thus far managed to resist the commercialization. It won't last forever. Eventually, that it'll become kind of a it'll become commercialized in some way, shape, or form. Probably as we continue to take it over with bunnies for some reason. Don't ask. I don't know. Maybe I'll do some research on that before Easter. So anyway, there's that quick and dirty history on Christmas. Again, my main sources were toffspot.blogspot.com and newadvent.com. Next episode will be a little bit closer to Christmas. I think I will probably finally do my wrap up on the Catholic Abuse Scandal 2.0. I was originally planning on doing that for this week, but decided, let's do the Christmas thing. And I've got to do a lot more reading and research on that, just find out what the latest developments are anyway. And so we'll probably be coming to you with that next week. So until then, keep on fighting the good fight, and we will see you next time.